So like Dan said, I think most of my speeches have followed this trend of being very technological and very technically detailed, but I wanted to go back to some of my earlier styles, which is talking about deeper topics in film and in literature that I like exploring. And this is actually a funny topic because Ashwin and I in high school started a film podcast where we actually discussed some of these exact ideas. So it's going to be funny hearing him evaluate my speech, given that we've had these exact conversations before. But I wanted to talk about cities and their role in conveying complex themes in film, and especially in film noir, which is this idea of the darker, more like black comedy type films that explore the darker sides to society. So I'm going to talk about two films in my speech, the first of which is Seven by David Fincher from 1995. And the second one that a lot of you may be familiar with is Parasite by Bong Joon-ho from 2019. These are very different movies, but I think they both tackle this idea of exploring societal conflict and strife and using cities as like as a powerful instrument to share those ideas. So first I'll start with Seven. And Seven revolves around this main villain character who is unnamed. He goes by John Doe, but he's a serial killer that commits murders based on the seven deadly sins in Christianity, like sloth, greed, lust, etc. And so the two main protagonists are these two detectives that are investigating this series of brutal murders. And one of the main themes in this whole movie is this constant background image of like a dark, grimy city that's dominated by rain. There's this constant, unrelenting downpour that's pretty much there throughout the whole movie. And it adds this very grim and bleak overtone to the film that's, I think, actually an intentional choice by David Fincher, because Andrew Walker, who wrote the film, actually based it on his experiences growing up in New York City during the late 1980s, when it was a time of rampant drug addiction and crime in the city. So even though this was filmed in LA, the actual setting and imagery is very much evocative of like a city in the 80s during the crack epidemic and all of the crime waves back then. Now, what's interesting is that a lot of the victims in this movie also live in very derelict apartments that are really representative of like the bottom rungs in society, and just showing how much despair there can be in certain parts of society. And the city really lacks any kind of warmth or life. There's no parks, there's no cultural centers, there's no real activity going on other than the crime that we see here. And so the lack of warmth there creates this perfect breeding ground for crime and sin that's this pervading theme throughout the movie. Now, what's interesting is despite all of these qualities, the city actually remains nameless in the movie. The movie never talks about the name of the city, where it's located, anything like that. But I think that's sort of the point, because David Fincher is trying to convey this idea that the movie is not a commentary about a specific city. It's not about Chicago or Detroit or LA. Rather, it's a commentary on the state of American urban life, and more importantly, like the state to which it's decayed over time, like in the 1980s. Another way the city ties into the characters in this movie is the two detectives. So the two detectives are portrayed by Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman. Morgan Freeman plays this jaded older detective who's had his fair share of experiences with crime. And he has this perspective that the city has just it's gone to a state where people are treating apathy like a virtue because they're so used to the crime that they're not even reacting to it, right? On the other hand, Brad Pitt plays this very young, ambitious, and optimistic detective who wants to really get rid of the crime in the city. But what's fascinating about the movie is that he actually ends up being consumed by his anger toward the villain, and he actually ends up becoming one of the main sinners in the plot. So it's really showing how like his optimism has become destroyed by just the city itself, right? Which is kind of like this, it's kind of a tragic hero personality that he plays in the movie. Now, the main villain, John Doe, is played by Kevin Spacey. And like I said, he's nameless. So again, it's not that it's about a specific villain, like in other superhero villain movies or anything like that. But more importantly, I think what's interesting is that when Brad Pitt calls Spacey a lunatic for the kinds of crimes he commits, his response is that it doesn't matter who I am. My identity is not the point here. And again, it's this idea that it's not about who the villain is. It's the fact that the city is like the perfect setting for this crime to happen. So the whole movie is almost taking away power from the characters. And it's this kind of hopeless tale of how the setting and like the milieu is just a good breeding ground for crime and sin and despair. So again, not a very optimistic movie, but I think it does a great job incorporating the city into pushing that theme of crime and sin and everything like that. Okay, the second movie I want to talk about is Parasite, which I think a lot of you may be more familiar with than Seven. So Parasite is about socioeconomic conflict between two classes of people in South Korea. And the two main families are the Kims and the Parks. The Kims are a lower class family, and the Kims live in a semi-basement flat in literally like the lower elevation parts of the city. So there's a very strong visual imagery here that comes from the fact that they live basically underground, because the apartment itself has very little access to sunlight. In fact, the only way sunlight can get into the apartment is through this window that's shown in the left picture here. But what's crazy is that because of this window being there, which is a small little glimpse of hope into sunlight, that window is also a way for burglars to break into the apartment. So because of that, they have to board up the window with these bars. And ironically, even though these bars are protecting them from burglars, it's also visually symbolizing the prison and sort of like the lack of social mobility that they have by being stuck in this place underground. So I thought that was a pretty powerful picture that the movie depicts. But also what's ironic is that the only place where they can get Wi-Fi in this apartment is in the bathroom next to the toilet. And it's crazy that the toilet is actually the highest elevated part of this apartment. So it's this sort of like comic irony of how they're so far down in the rungs of society that the highest they can achieve is just by going to the bathroom, right? Which is kind of, it's a comic twist, but again, it's like a good visual theme that's pushed in this movie. Now, on the flip side, there are the Parks. So the Parks live in a hilltop mansion in the city. So on the one hand, they have access to great natural light. The apartment is it's not even an apartment, it's a home that's made with lavish modern materials like marble and stone and glass. But more importantly, they live on a hilltop where their entire home is walled off by this massive stone wall from the rest of society. So they literally are shielded from the darker, grimmer aspects of society, and they've essentially bought the luxury of ignorance because they're able to ignore the hardships that the other people are going through in society by sort of being on this castle on a hill where they don't need to worry about what other people below them are going through. So the ignorance of the Parks is a major theme that pervades the entire movie. Now, one of the main events that happens in this movie is a big rainstorm, right? And so the Kims actually work in the Parks' home as their servants. And during the rainstorm, they're forced to go back from the Parks' home down to their home in the semi-basement, down this long staircase. It might be a little hard to see here, but these pictures are showing like one long staircase that goes down the city. Now, what's crazy here is that in a time of danger, like a rainstorm, they're forced to use the staircase to go back to where they came from in the lower rung society. And the staircase is kind of this cruelly ironic hint at the fact that despite a staircase being a way for them to go from the bottom of society up to the top, like it's a way for them to achieve social mobility, yet they're forced to use that same vehicle to go back down to where they came from in a time of hardship, like a rainstorm. So the staircase is a very cruelly ironic motif in this movie. And I think it points to the fact that it's almost like it's a tantalizing opportunity for them to escape the place where they came from. Despite it being there, they're forced to use the exact same avenue to go back to where they came from and basically escape the nice, lush apartment where they work. Now, one final thing I want to talk about is about the rainstorm is that it really is just a metaphor about classism in this movie, because the Parks have a very different take on the rainstorm. The wife or the mother of the family the next day in the car remarks that because of the rain, there's no pollution in the sky, and therefore it's a great, nice day outside. But the driver, who's the father of the Kim family, who's been living in this flooded rainstorm, which has destroyed all of his belongings in his home, is really reflecting on the fact that, again, they have no conception of the hardships that they go through when they're living in two separate sides of society. And the physical separation they have in elevation really just drives that point home and reinforces it. So again, I think in both of these movies, the cities are used not only just as a setting, like they would be in any movie, but the cities are used as a lens to inspect the state of affairs and the health of society. And more often than not, the cities are used to examine the lack of function in societies, whether it's classism and socioeconomic strife, or in the case of Seven, like the rampant crime and sin and lack of hope that really just permeates through the entire setting. So I think this is a really interesting way that cities can be used almost as like another character in plots. They're not just settings, they're like characters. And I think a lot of other TV and a lot of other movies make use of this, but I wanted to point out these two movies in particular because I think they do a particularly strong job of that. So I hope that was interesting, and thanks for listening.